Anatomy, musculoskeletal system. In this video, we're not going to deal with one bone in particular, but we're going to take a look at the skull as a whole, paying particular attention to all of those structures that are created by the interaction between the bones that constitute it. First, we need to make a distinction between the parts that make up the skull. The first important division is that between neurocranium and splancocranium, delimited by the so-called craniofacial line. This line begins at the frontonasal joint, or better, at the nasion, after which it ascends along the brow arch, reaches the junction with the greater wing of the sphenoid, runs along the zygomatic bone, and then continues along the anterior margin of the sphenoid. This line then divides neurocranium and splancocranium. Another interesting line is the one that divides the vault from the base of the skull. This line also begins at the nasion, follows the eyebrow arch and the margin of the frontal bone, and then it enters on the lateral aspect of the greater wing of the sphenoid, following the temporal crest, which here is only hinted at, and then continues posteriorly to the external occipital protuberance. In doing so, an almost perfect division is formed. This starts from the frontal bone at the nasion and then reaches the external occipital protuberance. Here you have the limit between the base and the vault. Let's now analyze the external configuration of the skull, starting right at the vault. As you can see, the vault of the skull does not have a large number of structures, except for the two parietal foramina and the sutures between the various bones. We can find the frontoparietal suture, called the coronal suture, the sagittal suture between the two parietals, the suture between the parietals, and the occipital bone, which is called the lambdoid suture, that is very similar to the Greek lambda. The highest bone of the vault is located in the middle of the central suture and is called the vertex of the skull. Let's now analyze the lateral aspect of the skull. To analyze this aspect, some bones of this splancocranium have to be included as well. The main structures we can find in this area are the temporal fossa, the infratemporal fossa, and finally the pterygopalatine fossa. But let's start with the temporal fossa, which is the fossa that forms above the zygomatic process. It is a cavity composed of two walls, the medial wall and the anterior wall. The first is given by the temporalis and the greater wing of the sphenoid. The anterior wall is formed by the posterior aspect of the zygomatic bone. Superiorly and inferiorly, it is free. Posteriorly, it is largely open, except for a small portion of the zygomatic process of the temporalis. This fossa provides a point of adhesion to the temporal masticatory muscle. The infratemporal fossa, as its name suggests, lies below the temporal fossa. Its anterior wall consists of the zygomatic and maxillary, while its medial wall consists of the greater wing of the sphenoid, the lower part of the latter, and the external pterygoid process. Posteriorly and inferiorly, it is open, while superiorly, it communicates with the temporal fossa. A particular feature, however, is its lateral wall that is formed by the branch of the mandible, which is not displayed here. There are numerous structures, both muscular and non-muscular, in this fossa. The last interesting area in the lateral region of the skull is the pterygopalatine fossa, about which we have already spoken when speaking about different bones. The anterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa is the posterior aspect of the maxilla, while its posterior wall is the anterior aspect of the external pterygoid lamina, and its medial wall the pterygopalatine incisure of the palatine bone. Its lateral aspect is not there, as this fossa communicates with the temporal fossa. It is exactly through this fossa that the maxillary nerve, which will then be distributed throughout this area, exists. But let's now look at the lower face of the skull. What we should have seen was the palate, formed by the maxillary bones and the palatine bones, with a cruciform suture. Between these two pairs of bones, then there is the middle region, formed by the sphenoid and the temporal pyramid. Technically, its limit should be the limit of the occipital bone. In this region, we can observe the pterygoid processes in the conate as well as the various foramina of the sphenoid, which will be discussed in a moment. Finally, the posterior region consists almost entirely of the occipital bone, with its large foramen, its condyles, and its two pairs of foramina on each side. And the central part is the pharyngeal tubercle. Let's now move on to analyze the inner surface of the skull. As for the vault, there is not much to say. The surface is concave and has the imprints of the circumvolutions, arteries, and cerebral veins. As for the whole series of ridges inside, we have already spoken about the individual bones. Instead, it is much more interesting to observe its base. As you can see, the base is a rather complex structure. 3 cranial fossae are delimited within the base: an anterior cranial fossa, a middle cranial fossa, and a posterior cranial fossa. So, let's go and study the boundaries well. The anterior cranial fossa has as its anterior limit the limit between the base and the vault. Posteriorly, however, its limit is the sharp margin of the great wings of the sphenoid, anterior clinoid processes, limit of the olfactory concha, and so on. Specular on the other side. In addition, some interesting structures can be observed, such as the nasal concha, the lamina cribrosa of the ethmoid, and the roof of the orbital surface. Also considered part of the base, and mainly of the anterior fossa, are the frontal crest, which begins at this point, and the optic holes, which are considered internal to the frontal fossa, since they are present right on the border margin. The middle cranial fossa, on the other hand, has as its anterior limit the interface with the anterior cranial fossa, and as its posterior limit the upper margin of the temporal pyramid and the margin of the body of the sphenoid. Within this fossa are many holes and structures. First of all, the saddle torsica for the pituitary gland, the apex of the pyramid with the outlet of the carotid canal, the superior orbital fissure of the sphenoid, the round hole, the oval hole, the spinous hole, always belonging to the sphenoid, the hiatus of the facial canal, and the Lazarus hole. The latter is formed between the sphenoid at the level of the body and the apex of the temporal pyramid, which is crossed by the Davidian nerve. The posterior cranial fossa, on the other hand, is given by the posterior in the superior margin of the pyramid. It includes the posterior part of the temporal bone and all the occipital bones. Its posterior limit is the base vault interface. Within it are the great occipital foramen, the hypoglossal grooves, and the condylar foramen, the occipital clavus, the openings of the internal acostomatus, and the vestibular aqueduct. And finally, the great jugular foramen, formed by the jugular processes of the occipital and temporal bone, where, when the internal jugular passes on one side and then on the other side, these spines divide the whole into two, the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is the structure of the skull as a whole. This video was created thanks to Anatomy Learning, an interesting free web app. The hyperlink can be found in the description. Instead, the text used for the concepts is Human Anatomy of Eddie Hermes. Thanks for watching.